All right, welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. As always, we're going to get right into it. You know the deal. We dig into all the research so you don't have to, and then we deliver the key insights.
Yeah, and I think this week's paper is a really fascinating one.
It is. It is. I was really interested in this one, and the title itself kind of gives it away a bit.
Yeah, there's no beating around the bush with this one.
It's high cost of slow energy transitions for emerging countries.
On the case of Egypt's pathway options.
Yes, exactly. So we are going very granular here.
Very specific case study.
And you know what I always find so interesting about these very granular case studies is obviously on the surface, it's about Egypt.
Right.
But it's really about so much more than that because Egypt represents what?
A whole class of emerging economies, and particularly those with that Sunbelt potential, right?
Yeah.
A lot of solar resources, growing economies.
Yeah, and so it's that whole, that whole dance between trying to, improve people's lives, which obviously requires, a lot of energy, and at the same time trying to meet climate goals.
Yeah, how do you balance those things?
No,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's really what this is all about. I was very curious to see what they would come up with.
And what's really exciting about this paper is they actually do some in-depth modeling.
Yes.
So it's not just kind of qualitative analysis. They actually have real data, real modeling, and they explore different scenarios of Egypt's energy future
Yeah.
out to 2050.
Yeah. And they pull on all sorts of interesting sources for this.
Yeah, they have like Egyptian government data, international reports, things like that.
RENA, IEA, all that stuff.
Yeah, the acronyms.
So that's what we're diving into today. Let's kind of take a step back for a moment.
Yeah.
What is the Paris Agreement? Why does it matter? Why are we even talking about all this?
Well, the Paris Agreement is, as you know, this landmark international agreement
Yeah.
where pretty much every country in the world has signed on to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and with the aim of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and ideally 1.5 degrees,
Yeah.
and to reach net zero emissions by the middle of the century.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people listening probably already know this.
They probably do.
But I still think it's worth reminding people, because every once in a while you kind of forget, oh yeah, this is like a huge global thing.
It's a massive global effort.
This is a global effort that we're all supposedly on board with.
Right. Theoretically, yeah.
Theoretically, yeah, I know.
And it's hard, right? Because all these countries have different levels of development, different starting points,
Yeah, and different resources.
different resources.
So in the case of Egypt, this is an example of a country that has, an emerging economy. It's considered an emerging market, right?
Yeah.
It has massive potential for solar,
Massive.
but it's also trying to, increase the quality of life for its people, which requires, more energy,
Energy, yeah.
more, economic growth, and it's there's this really interesting dance. So let's talk specifically about Egypt. The paper goes into a lot of detail about this, but, paint a picture for me. What does Egypt's energy system look like right now, in 2019, let's say?
Yeah, so back in 2019, the vast majority of their energy, about 95%, was actually coming from fossil fuels,
Yeah.
primarily natural gas. And renewables, at that point, only accounted for about 5%.
Yeah, and so it was mainly hydro, wind, a little bit of solar PV.
A little bit, yeah.
It was interesting in the way they phrased this in the study. There's this sort of tension between, the global community pushing for this very fast transition to 100% renewables, ideally by 2050.
Right.
But then you have, each individual country sort of doing their own planning, and they're not always on the same page.
Right, and that's exactly what the study is getting at.
Right, and you see this in the case of Egypt.
So in the paper, they looked at, they compared what Egypt's own plan was at that point in time, which was called the Integrated Sustainable Energy Strategy, the ICES,
Yeah.
and compared that to what, the International Renewable Energy Agency was saying, or IRENA.
Yeah.
And what they found is that, the IRENA recommendations were much more ambitious than Egypt's own stated targets, particularly when it came to the growth of renewables in the electricity sector.
Yeah, and it's not just that the targets were different.
But-
The time frames were also different. Like, IRENA was recommending a certain level of renewable energy deployment by 2030.
2030.
But Egypt's own plan was aiming for something similar, but by 2035. So there was this kind of 5-year gap.
This lag. Yeah.
And then there was this other, interesting wrinkle, which was that the ICES, Egypt's plan, still included provisions for developing new coal and nuclear power capacity.
Right.
Which obviously is a bit of a head scratcher when you think about this global push towards 100% renewables.
Yeah, and it kind of goes against the grain of what a lot of the international organizations in the scientific community are saying is the best way to achieve these climate goals.
Exactly, exactly. So they lay all of this out. They do a really good job of explaining, kind of the current landscape, what Egypt's thinking, what some of the international organizations are recommending.
Right.
And then they go on to talk about, well, what are some of the limitations of the research that's been done so far?
Yeah.
Like, what are the gaps in our understanding of Egypt's potential for this energy transition? What were some of those things that they pointed out?
So one thing that they pointed out is that a lot of the previous studies were using, they were based on information about renewable energy technologies
Mhm.
that was kind of outdated.
Yeah.
And we all know this sector is just moving so quickly. The prices are coming down, the
Every,
efficiency is going up.
every month, every year. Yeah.
So if you're still relying on old cost data, your conclusions might be very different from what's actually possible today. And then another limitation that they pointed out is that a lot of the existing research on Egypt's renewable energy potential,
Hmm.
they didn't have this really high spatial resolution, right?
Mhm.
So they didn't really look at like different parts of the country in detail and see like, oh, this region is really good for solar. This region is really good for wind.
Yeah. And the thing about solar, we talk about solar like it's one thing,
Right.
but obviously different parts of the world, have different levels of solar irradiance.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so you need to be able to model that very precisely to really know, okay, what is the true potential here?
Yeah, exactly. So, having that detailed spatial data is really important for planning a successful energy transition. And then another limitation they highlighted is that a lot of the previous studies focused almost exclusively on the power sector,
Yeah.
like how do we generate electricity? But they didn't really look at, other energy
The
sectors.
connections.
Yeah, so they didn't look at heating or transport or how these sectors could potentially be electrified.
Or the role of desalination.
Or desalination, which is a huge issue for Egypt given their water scarcity.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I think one of the most important limitations that they addressed is the lack of attention given to energy storage and what we call sector coupling,
Yeah.
which is, how do we connect these different energy sectors together?
Mm.
Because when you have a lot of solar and wind, you have this variability, right?
Right.
The sun isn't always shining, the wind isn't always blowing. So how do we store that energy?
Hmm.
How do we use it when we need it?
And how do we move it from one sector to another, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Like if we have excess electricity, can we use that to, power our cars? Can we use it to heat our homes?
Well, I could use it to make hydrogen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Can we use it to make synthetic fuels? So all of those things are really important to consider.
Yeah.
And it sounds like this study is one of the first ones that's really doing a comprehensive job of looking at all of these factors.
Mhm.
So they identify these limitations. They say, okay, this is what we're trying to overcome. And then they go into their methodology. They explain how they did it, which was, very complex. They used this advanced computer model.
Yeah.
They called it multinodal modeling, which allows them to, really look at all these different factors in detail. And then they test out 6 different potential futures for Egypt.
6 different scenarios.
6 different scenarios.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you walk us through those, because this is where it starts to get really interesting.
Yeah. So I think the way they kind of set up these scenarios is really interesting. They have what they call the best policy scenarios, right? So those are scenarios where they're assuming that policymakers are going to do things that are going to promote the energy transition.
Right, make good choices.
Make good choices.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they have several variations of those best policy scenarios.
Uh-huh.
And then they have some more kind of like baseline scenarios or business as usual scenarios that are kind of, more based on what's happening today or what's projected to happen based on current policies. So just to walk through those quickly, the first scenario is the best policy scenario high transmission, or the BPSHT.
Yeah.
And in this scenario, the idea is that Egypt's going to go all in on renewables. They're going to reach 100% renewable energy, zero CO2 emissions by 2050.
Boom. Done.
And they're going to have no limitations on building new transmission lines.
Right.
Right. So this is really looking at like, okay, what's the ideal scenario in terms of policy and infrastructure?
Yeah.
And then they have a variation of that, which is the BPS 4% high transmission. So this
Yeah.
is very similar, except that they introduced this constraint where renewable energy capacity can only grow by a maximum of 4% per year.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The reason why they did that, if I understand correctly, is they're trying to get at, okay, even if we can't do this crazy fast transition,
Right.
what if we have a slightly more measured but still ambitious pace?
Right.
Is that still viable?
Is that still achievable and cost effective?
Ex-
And then they have the BPS low transmission, which is the same as the first scenario, but they put limits on how much electricity can be moved between different regions.
Yeah.
So this is looking at, what if we don't invest heavily in upgrading the grid? What are the implications of that?
Right.
And then they have this really interesting scenario called the BPS no forcing.
Yes.
And in this scenario, they basically remove all the policy targets.
Yeah.
You don't have any specific targets for renewable energy. They don't factor in the cost of carbon emissions.
Mhm.
And they don't include power to X technologies.
Right.
So this is really just letting the market decide,
Yeah.
based purely on economics.
It's like a free market, libertarian Ayn Rand scenario.
Exactly.
So see what happens.
So, and they do this to see how far renewables could penetrate the market just based on cost alone, without any government intervention.
And then the last two scenarios, which are, kind of the baseline scenarios, you have the current policy scenario, or CPS, which, unsurprisingly is based on the government's stated targets and plans.
As they stood in 2019 when they were writing the paper.
Yeah, exactly. And then they have the delayed policy scenario.
The DPS, yeah.
And the DPS is interesting because it's actually a little bit more ambitious than the current policy scenario,
Yeah.
but it still doesn't quite get to 100% renewables.
Right.
And it does include things like the cost of carbon emissions.
In power to X.
In power to X, yeah. So it's sort of like a middle ground approach. It's like, okay, we're going to do a little bit better than we're doing now,
Yeah.
but we're not going to go all in on this crazy fast transition.
Right.
So that's the setup. They have these 6 different scenarios that they model.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that surprised me the most was the results.
Yeah.
Because, I went into this thinking, okay, well, obviously the best policy scenario, the one where they go all in on renewables, that's going to be the best outcome for climate change.
Right.
But it's also probably going to be the most expensive. Right, you would think, yeah. But it turns out that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah. And that's one of the big surprises of this paper, is that actually the BPS 4% high transmission scenario emerged as the least cost pathway
Yeah.
to get to 100% renewable energy and zero emissions.
And it wasn't just marginally less expensive.
Yeah, it was significantly cheaper.
Yeah, it was significantly less expensive than some of the other options, including the delayed policy scenario.
Which, on the surface, you would think, oh, that's going to be the cheapest one because we're delaying the investments.
You're kicking the can down the road.
But actually, what they found is that by delaying those investments, you end up kind of locking yourself into these more expensive pathways in the long run.
It's like the interest on your debt just keeps compounding.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So let's unpack that winning scenario, the BPS 4% high transmission. What does that energy system actually look like? If we were to fast forward to 2050 and Egypt has successfully implemented this plan, what are we talking about?
Yeah, so in 2050, in this scenario, Egypt's completely transformed its energy system. So the electricity sector is dominated by solar PV. That's like 93% of all electricity generation.
Wow.
Wind is about 6%, and then hydro makes up the rest.
So basically all renewables.
All renewables.
Yeah.
For heating, it's a little bit more of a mix, but there's a significant shift towards electric heating with heat pumps. That's about 60% of the heating demand.
Yeah.
And then you have e-fuels, which are made from renewable electricity, contributing about 18%, some solar thermal systems, and a little bit of biomass and waste.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to point out that the e-fuels, like we were saying earlier, that this is where that sector coupling comes in, right?
Right.
Because you're essentially using excess renewable electricity to create these fuels that can then be used in sectors that are harder to electrify, like, heavy industry or aviation or shipping.
Exactly, yeah. And then in transport, road transport's still the biggest chunk.
Yeah.
And that's met by a mix of direct electricity, so electric vehicles,
Yeah.
about 46%. And then you have Fischer-Tropsch fuels, which are also synthetic fuels made from renewable electricity, 27%.
Yeah.
And then some e-hydrogen and e-methane.
Yeah, and that's interesting. We talk a lot about electric vehicles.
Right.
But this study highlights the fact that, even in a highly renewable energy system, there's probably still going to be a role for these synthetic fuels.
Particularly for those harder to abate sectors. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then last but not least, water desalination.
Yeah.
Which, as we mentioned, is a huge issue for
That's
Egypt.
massive. Yeah.
And under this scenario, it's completely powered by renewable electricity.
100%. Yeah.
So, you look at this picture and it's like, wow, that is a very different Egypt
It's a completely transformed energy system. Yeah.
than what they have today. And so, aside from the environmental benefits, which are obvious,
Mhm.
you're getting to zero CO2 emissions. What are some of the other benefits of this, 4% growth scenario?
So I think one of the key things they highlight is that, yes, it's the least cost pathway. The overall cost is lower.
Yeah.
But then also the levelized cost of electricity in 2050 under this scenario is only 24 euros per megawatt hour,
Which is crazy.
which is ridiculously low. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about electricity that is cheaper than what most people are paying for fossil fuel-based electricity today.
Right now. Yeah.
So, I think that's a really powerful message that, this isn't just about saving the planet. This
Yeah.
is also about creating a more affordable, more sustainable energy system for everyone.
Right.
And that I think is a really important takeaway. And then, we've talked about the technology, the solar, the wind, the storage, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I found really interesting was this idea of the enabling factors. Like,
Yeah.
okay, what needs to happen for this to actually be possible? And they highlight three key things. First is the dominance of solar PV.
Right.
They make a really strong case for why solar is going to be, the workhorse of this new energy system.
And it makes sense, right? Egypt's in the Sun Belt. They have amazing solar resources.
Yeah.
The costs have come down dramatically.
Yeah.
And you can deploy solar at all scales, right?
Huh.
You can have these massive utility scale solar farms, but you can also have rooftop solar on individual homes and businesses.
Yeah.
So it's very versatile.
Exactly. And then the second enabling factor that they talk about is the importance of grid interconnections.
Yeah.
As we were saying earlier, it's not enough to just generate the electricity.
Right.
You have to be able to move it around.
Yeah. And they really highlight the importance of a smart, interconnected grid that allows you to trade electricity between regions where there's surplus generation and regions where there's high demand.
Yeah, and it's not just about moving it from one place to another. It's also about being able to balance supply and demand. Because when the sun is shining, you're going to have a lot of solar power. But when the sun goes down, you're going to need something else to fill in the gaps.
Exactly. And so having that interconnected grid
Mm.
allows you to kind of smooth out those fluctuations.
And it also reduces the need for storage, right?
Yeah.
Because if you can move the electricity around to where it's needed, you don't necessarily have to store as much of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then the third enabling factor, which we've already touched on a little bit, is this whole idea of energy storage and sector coupling.
Right.
They basically say that, if you want to reach 100% renewables, you absolutely have to have these things.
Yeah.
You need storage to balance out the variability of solar and wind.
Yeah, and they highlight the fact that, in the scenarios where they do achieve 100% renewables, they have to deploy a lot more storage than in the scenarios where they don't.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's a direct correlation.
It's like if you want to go all in on renewables, you have to be willing to invest in the storage to make it work. And then sector coupling is this idea of linking the electricity sector to other sectors, like heating and transport.
Yeah.
And this is where things like power-to-X technologies come in. Right?
Yeah, so power to X is basically taking electricity
Yeah.
and converting it into other forms of energy that can be used in different sectors,
Like hydrogen.
like hydrogen, like e-fuels, like e-methane.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is really crucial because not all sectors can be fully electrified.
Right.
Some things are just really hard to electrify,
Like airplanes.
like airplanes, like long-haul shipping, like certain industrial processes.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you want to decarbonize those sectors, you need some other way to do it.
Yeah.
And Power to X is one of the most promising solutions we have right now.
So we've talked about the benefits of a rapid transition. We've talked about the enabling factors.
Yeah.
But the title of the paper, High Costs of Slow Energy Transitions, it really emphasizes the economic aspect.
Mm.
So let's dive into that a little bit. What did they find about the costs associated with different paces of transition?
So one of the interesting things is that even in the scenario where they don't have any specific policies in place, they just let the market decide. The BPS no forcing.
Yeah.
They still get to about 80% renewables by 2050.
which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and that tells you that renewable energy technologies are already becoming so cost competitive
Yeah.
that they can penetrate the market even without any explicit government support.
Yeah. And it's interesting, if you look at the trends, it's likely that that number would be even higher
Yeah, it might
today.
be even higher, yeah.
Because this paper was written a couple of years ago,
Right.
and the cost of renewables has just continued to plummet.
Exactly.
So that's a really encouraging sign. But then, when they look at the current policy scenario, the CPS, the one where Egypt is just sort of doing what it's doing now,
Yeah,
they find that it leads to much higher CO2 emissions
right.
and also significantly higher costs.
Yeah, because you're locking yourself into these fossil fuel infrastructure,
Yeah.
which is becoming increasingly uneconomical.
Yeah, and it's not just about the cost of the fuel itself. It's also about the cost of, the health impacts of air pollution, the cost of climate change.
Yeah, all the externalities, all the things that aren't reflected in the price of fossil fuels.
Yeah, exactly. So, the current policy scenario is not a good outcome, either for the planet or for the economy.
No, it's really not.
But then the most surprising finding, to me at least, was the delayed policy scenario.
Yeah.
The DPS.
Right.
Because like we said earlier, this is the scenario where they're doing a little bit better than the current policy.
Yeah, they're trying. They're a little bit more ambitious.
But they're not going all in on renewables.
Right.
And what they found was that this scenario actually turns out to be the most expensive of all.
The most expensive, yeah.
And the reason for that, they explain, is this lock-in effect in the transport sector.
Yeah, so because they delay the transition to electric vehicles, they end up having to rely more heavily on those e-fuels,
Right.
which are still relatively expensive.
Yeah.
And they haven't built up the infrastructure for direct electrification or that sector coupling.
Right. So it's like they're sort of trying to do the right thing, but they're doing it in a half-hearted way.
Yeah, they're hedging their bets.
And it ends up backfiring on them.
It ends up costing them more in the long run.
Yeah. So the message here is really clear.
Be ambitious.
Be ambitious, yeah.
Don't delay.
Don't delay the transition.
Yeah.
If you're going to do it right.
And do it now.
And do it now, yeah. So what are some of the specific recommendations that they make for Egypt based on all of these findings?
So they say that Egypt needs to revise its national plans
Yeah.
to be more in line with best practices and the goals of the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, get more ambitious.
Yeah, basically. And they say that Egypt needs to set clear, quantifiable targets for renewable energy deployment.
In all sectors.
In all sectors, yeah.
Not just electricity.
Not just electricity, exactly.
Yeah.
They say that they need to shift their investments towards solar PV.
Yeah.
Which, makes sense given their resources.
Yeah.
They say that they need to significantly increase grid transmission capacity.
Especially between north and south.
Especially between north and south, yeah.
Yeah.
And they say that they need to really promote this idea of a harmonized transition across all energy sectors.
Through electrification and power to X.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's like, don't just focus on the power sector.
Right?
Think about how all of these different pieces fit together.
Yeah.
And make sure that you're making investments that are going to benefit the whole system.
Yeah.
So, it's a really comprehensive set of recommendations. And I think the thing that's really important to highlight here is that these recommendations are not just for Egypt.
No.
They're for any country that's in a similar situation.
Any Sunbelt country, any emerging economy that has these kinds of resources, the message is clear. You can do this. It's possible, it's affordable, and it's the best way forward.
So, no pressure, but no pressure.
Right.
So obviously every study has its limitations.
Of course.
What are some of the limitations that they acknowledged in this paper?
So they said that, they would have liked to have more detailed data in some areas, particularly outside of the power sector.
Yeah.
They also acknowledged that they made some simplifications in their modeling, particularly when it came to representing the industrial sector and the grid infrastructure.
Right, which is understandable. I mean, these are complex systems.
Incredibly complex.
Yeah.
You can't model every single detail.
Yeah.
And then they also said that they didn't really delve into things like vehicle-to-grid interaction, which is this idea of using electric vehicles as a source of storage for the grid.
Right.
Or detailed social aspects, which is, how does this transition impact people's lives? How do we ensure that it's equitable?
Right, which is a really important consideration. But, obviously they can't cover everything in one paper.
Not in one paper yet.
So, they acknowledge these limitations, but they also highlight some really interesting avenues for future research.
Yeah.
What are some of those things that you thought were particularly intriguing?
So I thought it was really interesting that they talked about the potential for Egypt to become an exporter of e-fuels and e-chemicals.
Yeah.
So the idea is that, they could use their abundant solar resources to produce these products, not just for domestic use, but also for export to other countries that might not have as much renewable energy potential.
Like Europe.
Like Europe, for example, yeah.
Which is interesting because right now Europe is very reliant on Russia for natural gas.
Exactly.
And so this could be a way for Egypt to, kind of step in and fill that gap.
Yeah, and diversify its own economy.
Yeah, exactly. And then they also talked about the potential for even higher levels of solar PV penetration
Yeah.
combined with things like vehicle-to-grid integration.
Yeah, so, really pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Yeah, and seeing, how much solar can we actually integrate into the system?
Yeah.
And how can we use these other technologies to make it work?
Yeah,
So it's a really exciting area for future research.
absolutely.
So, we've covered a lot of ground here. This has been a fascinating deep dive.
That's been a lot of fun.
What is the core message, if you had to sum it up in one sentence, that you think people should take away from this?
I think the core message is that for emerging economies with abundant solar resources, like Egypt, a fast and ambitious transition to 100% renewable energy by 2050,
Hmm.
it's not only possible, it's actually the most economically sound pathway.
And that is a really powerful message.
Yeah.
So, we always like to end these deep dives with a little something for our listeners to think about,
Yeah.
to kind of keep the conversation going.